Toxic in-laws tried to steal our dream house for their jobless daughter. They never expected our revenge. After years of saving, planning, and dreaming, my husband, Ryan, and I had finally done it. We'd bought our dream house. It wasn't a sprawling mansion or anything extravagant, but it was ours. A beautiful home with enough space to grow into and a backyard perfect for family gatherings. It was a culmination of years of hard work and sacrifices, and walking through those doors for the first time felt like stepping into a new chapter of our lives. We weren't naive about the process. Buying a house had been a roller coaster, filled with bidding wars, mountains of paperwork, and months of waiting. But when we finally got the keys, it all felt worth it. We spent our first few days in a blissful haze, unpacking boxes, decorating rooms, and imagining all the memories we'd create within those walls. But as anyone with a toxic family knows, peace and happiness rarely last long before the chaos finds a way in. Ryan's family had always been complicated. His mother, Elaine, was the matriarch of their small but dysfunctional clan, a woman who thrived on control and manipulation. She had a knack for guilt-tripping anyone within earshot, using phrases like "family comes first" and "you wouldn't be here without me" as weapons. Then there was Ryan's sister, Jessica. If Elaine was manipulative, Jessica was entitled. She had spent most of her adult life bouncing between failed ventures and bad relationships, always expecting others to clean up her messes. Her latest disaster involved her husband, Derek, a self-proclaimed gamer, whose idea of contributing to the household was spending hours glued to his console, while Jessica juggled their 6 kids and a mountain of unpaid bills. Ryan and I had done our best to keep some distance from the drama. We helped when we could, loaning small amounts of money here and there or babysitting during emergencies, but we were careful not to let their chaos consume our lives. We knew that setting boundaries was the only way to maintain our sanity. But Elaine and Jessica had a way of pushing those boundaries, always testing just how far they could go. It started innocently enough. Elaine stopped by the house a week after we moved in, bringing a pie as a housewarming gift. She walked through the front door with her usual flair, commenting on everything from the paint colors to the size of the kitchen. At first, I thought her visit was genuine, a chance for her to share in our excitement. But as the tour continued, her compliments took on a strange edge. "This house is so big," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You two must feel lost in all this space with just the two of you. It's almost too much for a young couple, don't you think?" I brushed it off as her usual passive aggressiveness, but Ryan looked uneasy. He knew his mother better than anyone, and something about her tone set off alarm bells. The real trouble began when Jessica got involved. A few days after Elaine's visit, Jessica called Ryan out of the blue. She started with small talk, asking about the house and congratulating him on the purchase. But it didn't take long for the conversation to shift. "Mom says your place is amazing," Jessica said, her voice casual but probing. "It must be nice to have so much room. We've been struggling to make things work in our apartment. It's just so cramped with the kids. Derek's been out of work for a while, and it's been hard to keep up with rent." Ryan, always empathetic to a fault, listened patiently, but I could see the tension building in his shoulders as he paced the living room. Jessica was laying it on thick, weaving a sob story that was equal parts pity and manipulation. Then she dropped the bombshell. "You know," she said, her tone almost flippant, "if you guys ever feel like this house is too big for just the two of you, we'd be happy to take it off your hands. The kids would love the backyard, and it'd be such a blessing for us." Ryan froze mid-step, his face a mix of shock and disbelief. He stammered out a response, something polite but firm, before hanging up. When he told me what she'd said, I was speechless. The audacity of it was staggering. Jessica and Derek, who had never once offered us help or support, were now suggesting that we hand over our dream house as though it was a spare coat we didn't need. I thought that was the end of it, but Jessica wasn't done. Over the next few days, she ramped up her efforts, enlisting Elaine's help to turn up the pressure. Elaine called Ryan, her tone laced with guilt. She spoke about family obligations, about how Jessica and the kids were struggling and how Ryan, as the responsible one, had a duty to step in and help. She even had the audacity to suggest that we could always find another house, while Jessica and Derek had nowhere else to go. It was a coordinated attack, relentless barrage of calls, messages, and guilt trips designed to wear us down. But Ryan and I weren't about to let them win. What began as a single audacious request quickly turned into an all-out siege on our peace. Jessica's offhand suggestion that we give up our dream house for her family had been shocking, but it wasn't until Elaine joined forces with her that we began to see the extent of their determination. Jessica didn't just make the case for her situation, she crafted a narrative. In her version of events, she was the struggling mother of 6, doing everything she could to provide for her children while her husband, Derek, floundered in unemployment. Their cramped apartment, she claimed, was barely livable, a chaotic, overcrowded space that stifled the kids' potential and drained her energy. Every detail was designed to evoke sympathy, from descriptions of sleepless nights to tales of Derek's fruitless job search. She painted her family as victims of an unfair system, conveniently omitting Derek's refusal to work jobs he deemed beneath him, or her own tendency to spend money they didn't have on things they didn't need. Elaine, ever the self-appointed mediator, amplified Jessica's story at every turn. She framed their struggles as a moral dilemma, an opportunity for Ryan and me to prove our generosity and commitment to family. She spoke with an air of authority, as though it were her right to dictate how we should use our resources. The pressure came in waves, relentless and suffocating. Elaine called Ryan nearly every day, each conversation a carefully curated mix of guilt and praise. She would start by complimenting him on his success, emphasizing how proud she was of his accomplishments, before pivoting to Jessica's plight. "Wouldn't it be wonderful," she'd say, "if you could use your good fortune to help them get back on their feet?" Jessica, meanwhile, began enlisting other family members to her cause. She spun her sob story to anyone who would listen, painting us as selfish and ungrateful for not stepping up to help. The ripple effect was immediate. Relatives who had barely been involved in our lives suddenly emerged, offering unsolicited opinions on what family was supposed to mean. One aunt called Ryan to lecture him about the importance of sacrifice, recounting how she had given up her own savings years ago to help a cousin in need. A distant cousin messaged me, implying that we were lucky to have such a beautiful home and suggesting that it was only fair to share our blessings. The audacity of these comments was astounding, but they all carried the same underlying message: Jessica's needs outweighed our own. Ryan bore the brunt of the pressure. His family had always seen him as the responsible one, the dependable sibling who could be relied upon to clean up their messes. It was a role he had filled for years, often at great personal cost. I watched as the weight of their demands began to wear on him. He spent hours staring at his phone, reading and rereading their messages, his face a mixture of frustration and guilt. He wanted to help, to do the right thing, but the enormity of their request and the entitlement behind it was impossible to ignore. The stress seeped into our lives like a slow poison. Conversations about our future were interrupted by calls from Elaine or Jessica, each one more insistent than the last. The house, which had been our sanctuary, now felt like a battleground. Every room seemed to echo with their demands, their expectations casting a shadow over our joy. What frustrated me most was the sheer audacity of it all. This wasn't the first time Jessica had leaned on Ryan for help. Over the years, he had loaned her money, bailed her out of bad decisions, and even helped her cover rent on multiple occasions. Elaine had always supported these interventions, framing them as acts of familial duty. But this time, their expectations were staggering. They weren't just asking for financial support. They were asking us to give up our home, the symbol of everything we had worked so hard to achieve. And they weren't asking out of desperation, but entitlement. They believed it was their right to take what we had because, in their eyes, family came first no matter the cost. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure only intensified. Elaine began dropping by unannounced, her visits framed as check-ins, but always steering back to Jessica's situation. She would wander through the house, making comments about how much space we had and how wonderful it would be for children to grow up here. Jessica, for her part, started posting cryptic messages on social media, vague laments about family members who hoarded their blessings while others suffered. The posts were thinly veiled jabs at us, designed to garner sympathy and reinforce her narrative of victimhood. Ryan tried to reason with them at first. He suggested other solutions, offered advice on how Jessica and Derek could improve their situation, even looked into local resources they could use. But no matter what he proposed, it was never enough. They didn't want solutions, they wanted our house. The turning point came one evening when Ryan sat down after yet another call from Elaine. His face was pale, his shoulders slumped under the weight of everything they had thrown at him. He stared at the floor for a long time before finally meeting my gaze. There was something different in his eyes, a quiet resolve that hadn't been there before. For years, he had bent over backward to support his family, sacrificing his time, energy, and resources to clean up their messes. But this time was different. This time, they had gone too far. It was in that moment I knew he was done. Ryan's decision to draw a line in the sand marked a shift in the dynamic that had defined his relationship with his family for years. It was subtle at first, a quiet refusal to answer Elaine's calls, a deliberate avoidance of Jessica's messages. But as the days passed, his resolve hardened. He was done being the family's safety net, done sacrificing his peace and happiness to accommodate their chaos. The first real confrontation came when Elaine showed up unannounced one Saturday morning. Ryan and I had been in the backyard, sipping coffee and enjoying a rare moment of calm. The sight of her car pulling into the driveway immediately shattered the peace. Elaine wasted no time launching into her well-rehearsed speech. She spoke of family obligations, of how Jessica and the kids were struggling, and how we had the means to help. She framed it as a moral imperative, a test of Ryan's character and loyalty. Ryan didn't flinch. For the first time in his life, he stood firm. He told her in no uncertain terms that her request was unreasonable and that we would not be giving up our house. His tone was calm but resolute, leaving no room for negotiation. Elaine's reaction was swift and dramatic. Her face twisted in a mixture of shock and outrage as she accused Ryan of abandoning his family. She ranted about how Jessica had always looked up to him, how the kids needed stability, and how his refusal to help was tearing the family apart. But Ryan didn't budge. She left in a flurry of anger and tears, slamming the door on her way out. It was a moment that should have felt like a victory, a clear statement of our boundaries, but instead, it felt like the calm before a storm. Within hours, the fallout began. Jessica took to social media with a vengeance. Her cryptic posts about selfish family members escalated into outright accusations, complete with vague but pointed details that left no doubt about who she was targeting. She painted herself as the underdog, a mother struggling to provide for her children while her privileged brother refused to lift a finger to help. The posts quickly gained traction among family and friends, sparking a flood of comments and messages. Some expressed sympathy for Jessica, parroting her narrative about the importance of family. Others reached out to Ryan directly, questioning why he wasn't stepping up.
It was exhausting.
Every time Ryan silenced one message, another appeared, each one a reminder of how deeply Jessica and Elaine had entrenched themselves in their version of the truth. Then came the twist. A few days later, Ryan received a message from a mutual acquaintance, someone we hadn't spoken to in years. The message contained a screenshot of a private conversation between Jessica and Derek, one that had apparently been shared accidentally in a group chat. In the conversation, Jessica and Derek discussed their plans for the house. But it wasn't just about moving in. They were laughing about how easy it would be to pressure Ryan into giving them the house, speculating that once we caved, they could flip it for a profit and move somewhere nicer. Derek even joked about how much money they could get if they sold a house quickly, adding that he'd finally be able to buy the high-end gaming setup he'd been eyeing. Reading those messages was like a punch to the gut. Their plan wasn't just entitled, it was calculated and cold. They had no intention of using the house to improve their situation or provide stability for their kids. To them, it was a windfall, a way to cash in on our hard work and sacrifice without lifting a finger. Ryan was livid. The messages confirmed what we had both suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. that their pleas for help were nothing more than a con. Rather than confronting them directly, Ryan decided to share the messages with a few key family members, the same ones who had been the loudest in their criticism of our refusal to help. He sent them without comment, letting the words speak for themselves. The reaction was immediate. Family members who had previously sided with Jessica began reaching out, expressing shock and apologizing for their earlier judgments. Some tried to distance themselves from the drama entirely, while others confronted Jessica directly. Jessica, predictably, denied everything. She claimed the messages were taken out of context and accused Ryan of trying to sabotage her reputation. Derek stayed silent, likely knowing that any attempt to defend himself would only dig the hole deeper. But the damage was done. The carefully constructed narrative Jessica and Elaine had been pushing began to crumble, and their support within the family eroded almost overnight. For Ryan, it was a bittersweet victory. Exposing the truth brought a sense of validation, but it also reinforced the realization that his family's loyalty had always been conditional. The very people who had been so quick to judge him had turned on Jessica just as easily, their opinions shifting with the tide of public perception. As the dust began to settle, Ryan made another decision, one that would change the dynamic of his relationship with his family forever. After exposing Jessica and Derek's callous plan to exploit us, Ryan's resolve solidified. He wasn't just setting boundaries this time, he was reclaiming control over his life. The days of bending to Elaine's manipulations and Jessica's entitlement were over, and he intended to make that crystal clear. The fallout from the leaked messages rippled through the family like an earthquake. Relatives who had once been vocal in their support of Jessica suddenly went quiet, retreating from the drama to avoid taking sides. Others reached out to Ryan, some offering apologies, others sharing their own stories of Jessica's entitlement and Elaine's toxic behavior. But Elaine and Jessica weren't about to go quietly. Elaine took it upon herself to restore the family's fragile narrative, doubling down on her guilt-tripping tactics. She began calling Ryan almost daily, alternating between tearful pleas and angry outbursts. She accused him of turning the family against each other, of ruining Jessica's reputation, and even of disrespecting her as his mother. Jessica, meanwhile, shifted her strategy. The cryptic social media posts stopped, replaced by a campaign to portray herself as the true victim. She spoke of betrayal, of how her own brother had smeared her in front of the family, conveniently omitting any mention of the messages that had exposed her lies. For Ryan, the pressure was relentless. But this time, he wasn't facing it alone. We talked late into the night about how best to handle the situation, weighing the consequences of cutting ties against the toll of staying engaged. For Ryan, the decision wasn't just about the house. It was about breaking free from a toxic cycle that had defined his relationship with his family for as long as he could remember. Finally, one evening, he made his choice. He sat down and drafted a letter, addressed to Elaine and Jessica, laying out his position in clear, unambiguous terms. He explained that while he valued family, their actions had made it impossible to maintain a healthy relationship. He expressed his disappointment in their willingness to manipulate and exploit him, but he also made it clear that he wouldn't tolerate it any longer. The letter ended with a definitive statement. He was cutting off contact. When Ryan showed me the letter, I felt a mix of pride and sadness. It was a powerful step toward reclaiming his autonomy, but it was also a painful acknowledgement of the damage his family had done. He wasn't just severing ties, he was grieving the idea of what his family could have been. Sending the letter marked the beginning of a new chapter, but it also triggered a new wave of drama. Elaine's reaction was predictably explosive. She called Ryan repeatedly, leaving voicemails that ranged from tearful apologies to venomous accusations. She claimed he was being cruel and selfish, that he was abandoning his family when they needed him most. Jessica, meanwhile, leaned into her victim narrative, using the situation to garner sympathy from anyone who would listen. But the most unexpected twist came from Derek. A few days after the letter was sent, Derek reached out directly, not to apologize, but to confront Ryan. His message was filled with insults and threats, accusing Ryan of ruining their lives and vowing to make him pay for the fallout. It was laughable in its audacity, but it also underscored just how far gone Jessica and Derek were in their entitlement. Ryan didn't respond. Instead, he forwarded the message to one of the few family members who had remained neutral throughout the ordeal. The relative, a no-nonsense type with little patience for drama, quickly intervened, confronting Derek and making it clear that his behavior was unacceptable. The backlash was immediate, and Derek's threat stopped as quickly as they had started. For the first time, it felt like the tide was turning. The silence that followed was deafening. Elaine stopped calling, her messages reduced to occasional, guilt-laden emails that Ryan quickly deleted. Jessica and Derek retreated into their bubble, their campaign for sympathy falling flat in the face of the evidence Ryan had shared. For Ryan, the absence of their chaos was liberating. He threw himself into projects around the house, pouring his energy into turning our dream home into a space that truly felt like ours. The weight that had hung over him for years, the constant pressure to fix his family's problems, was finally gone. But the decision to cut ties wasn't without its challenges. Some family members struggled to accept Ryan's choice, expressing concerns about the long-term consequences of estrangement. Others outright criticized him, accusing him of being too harsh and urging him to reconcile before it's too late. Ryan listened, but he didn't waver. For the first time in his life, he was prioritizing his own well-being, and no amount of outside pressure would change that. As the weeks turned into months, the dust began to settle. Elaine and Jessica's attempts to control the narrative fizzled out, their influence within the family diminished by their own actions. Ryan and I, meanwhile, found a new sense of peace in the absence of their drama. But the story wasn't over yet. One evening, while sorting through the mail, Ryan found an envelope addressed to him in handwriting he didn't recognize. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter from Jessica. The contents were shocking. Jessica's letter lingered in the air like a storm cloud after Ryan read it. Her words dripped with desperation, painting herself as a victim of Derek's abandonment and her circumstances. She wasn't asking for help. She was demanding it, cloaking her entitlement in the guise of family loyalty. The twist, of course, was Derek's abrupt departure. According to her, he had left with what little money they had, retreating into oblivion while she was left to juggle 6 children and a mountain of unpaid bills. I could see the conflict in Ryan's expression as he folded the letter and placed it on the table. There was sympathy. Ryan wasn't the type to ignore someone in genuine distress, but it was tempered by years of manipulation, exploitation, and betrayal. Jessica's plight was undeniably tragic, but her behavior leading up to it had made it impossible to see her as an innocent party. We sat in silence for a long time, both processing the implications of the letter. Jessica's circumstances had changed, but her tactics had not. She still expected Ryan to swoop in and fix everything, as though the past few months of silence had never happened. Eventually, Ryan spoke. His voice was calm, almost detached, but I could tell he was choosing his words carefully. He said that while he felt for Jessica's children, he couldn't allow himself to be drawn back into her chaos. The messages she and Derek had exchanged, mocking us, planning to sell the house we worked so hard for, were still fresh in his mind. Her struggles, though difficult, didn't erase the entitlement and deceit that had led to this point. The following evening, Ryan drafted a letter in response. He spent hours at the dining table, pen in hand, staring at the blank page before slowly beginning to write. Each word came deliberately, as if he were carving it into stone. I didn't ask to see the letter while he was writing. This was his decision, and I trusted him to handle it in the way that felt right. When he finally finished, he showed it to me. It was a masterpiece of boundaries and clarity. Ryan expressed sympathy for Jessica's struggles, especially for her children, but he also laid out his position with firm finality. He explained that while he wished her the best, he would not be providing financial or emotional support. He reiterated the hurt caused by her actions and made it clear that his decision to cut contact was not something he took lightly, but something he needed to do for his own well-being. He ended the letter with a simple but powerful statement. I hope this situation helps you reflect on your choices and make the changes necessary to move forward. I will not be part of that journey, but I sincerely wish you and your children the best. The letter was mailed the next morning. Jessica's response came a week later, but it wasn't a plea for understanding or a heartfelt apology. It was a text message, a single, venomous line that perfectly encapsulated her refusal to take accountability. Thanks for nothing. Don't bother calling when you need family someday. Ryan read the message once and then deleted it without a word. In the months that followed, the silence from Elaine and Jessica became deafening. The calls and messages stopped completely, leaving an absence that felt strange at first, but quickly turned into relief. Without their constant chaos, Ryan and I found ourselves with more time, energy, and space to focus on our lives. For Ryan, the experience was transformative. Cutting ties with his mother and sister wasn't just about setting boundaries. It was about breaking a cycle that had defined his relationship with them for years. He no longer felt the weight of their expectations, the pressure to be the family's savior. For the first time in his life, he was living on his own terms. For me, the change was just as profound. Watching Ryan stand up to his family, reclaiming his sense of self, was inspiring. It reminded me of the importance of boundaries, not just in our relationships with others, but in how we treat ourselves. Our home, once a battleground for entitlement and manipulation, became a sanctuary again. We poured our energy into making it truly ours, filling it with the laughter and love that had been overshadowed by family drama for far too long. Occasionally, we heard updates about Jessica and Elaine through the family grapevine. Jessica had moved in with a distant relative, barely scraping by with the help of odd jobs and sporadic support from sympathetic family members. Derek was nowhere to be found, leaving her to handle the fallout of their shared decisions on her own. Elaine, meanwhile, had shifted her focus to other relatives, attempting to exert the same control and guilt-tripping tactics that had defined her relationship with Ryan. But her influence had waned. The truth about Jessica and Derek's actions had damaged her credibility within the family, and fewer people were willing to indulge her manipulations. For us, life moved on. Ryan and I celebrated our first anniversary in the house with a quiet dinner in the backyard, reflecting on how far we'd come. The weight of his family's expectations no longer hung over us, and for the first time in years, we felt free to plan our future without fear of interference. Looking back, the journey had been painful, but it had also been necessary. It taught us that family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about respect, accountability, and mutual support. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for yourself and others is to walk away. The lessons we learned weren't just about boundaries. They were about resilience, about finding strength in the face of adversity and choosing peace over chaos. As for Jessica and Elaine, their stories continued elsewhere, far removed from ours. The ties that once bound us were gone, replaced by the quiet certainty that we had made the right choice. Our dream home had become exactly that, a place of joy, growth, and new beginnings. And for the first time in a long time, Ryan and I felt truly at peace.